Got it. You put the sound on, okay?
Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Genie Seminar. This is the 21st of October, 2018, and we welcome you all. Today, we're going to have the third of the 8 items on the Mental Freedom Control Panel. I just remind everybody that this is being recorded and may be used by the public, and so by being here, you're giving your permission to for us to record this and make it available on the internet for the public. Now we've gone through the seven word switches that that elevate our thinking from the animal brain, the either-or way of thinking, to our higher level human brain, or what we've been calling our genie organ. And the genie organ has the ability to use imagination. And imagination is the very special quality that we humans have that allows us to use trial and error. In our imagination, we can try different things. We can make lots of mistakes in our imagination, and then we can select the one that's most likely to work. So the beautiful aspect of this, and that was one of Einstein's brilliant awareness, that he said imagination is one of the most important events in history, because it allows us to learn by finding answers in our imagination before we put them into practice, so we can make mistakes and not have a penalty. That's called no trial learning. No trial learning, and it's one of the things that makes us unique, that we can use our fantasy and our imagination and avoid mistakes. And of course, Einstein said that if we make a single mistake with nuclear weapons, it's the end of everything. So you can see the importance of the ability to learn to use our imagination and make our mistakes by when there's no penalty. Whereas for 3.5 billion years, we've been learning by trial and error. Virtually all species learn by trial and error. And so we've gone through those 7 word switches that elevate our thinking to our higher level, and we've gone through the 2 most powerful love creation skills, and we assert that one of the most powerful skills that we can learn is to love ourselves with the abundance that overflows to enrich the world. Another way of saying the similar kind of thing is the golden rule, is what's good for me and you, for my family and your family, for now and the future. See, all of those say, how can we work together? And there's no blaming, none of those other words that are negative words. So now we're going on to a new area, and we've already taken 2 of the 8 items in the Mental Freedom Control Panel. Now, we call it the control panel because we have 8 choices available to us for any item that we deal with. And they're brought into these simple ways of learning. If we become aware of these, there are 2 ways that are almost always successful and 7 that usually get us into trouble. So we started with the first of the 2, the blaming out response, and then we went to the blaming in response. So the blaming response is part of the fight response. We've said all of us are born innately pre-wired, or I use the word addicted, but we can say pre-wired or genetically, we're innately programmed to have a fight response. And in today's world, the way we express the fight response mentally using words is blaming. So we can blame out, and we see that very commonly, but we can also take that blaming response and direct it at ourselves, and that's called blaming in. Blaming is a good way to control people, because blaming in is also the word for guilt, when we attack ourselves in some way. So that's the fight response. Now today we're going to talk about the avoidance response. Now, avoidance is the equivalent of the flight response. So if we're all born with a fight-flight response, as we see the major way animals deal with their stress, they either fight or they run, because we use mental ways of dealing with things. We, instead of fighting and running, we do that too. We do what animals do, but we also blame others, and then we do what animals don't do. We teach our kids and we teach ourselves in ways to blame in, which is the word for guilt. We spend a lot of time with guilt. Some religions and some groups particularly favor guilt as a way of controlling people. So let's listen now to Brad's recording of the third response, the avoidance response. Welcome to Module 3 of the Educational Community Curriculum to make our life wonderful. The avoidance response is strand 3 of the 8 choices on the Mental Freedom Control Panel. It commonly leads us to what we don't want. Avoidance is one of the most prevalent negative actions because it is a mental expression of the flight part of the instinctive fight or flight instinct. Avoidance has many forms of expression, such as procrastination, lying, denial, substance abuse, and refusing to face difficult issues that really require mental problem solving.
Today's strand considers the third of the 8 choices available to our willpower to transform information into action. I've labeled it the avoidance response because it has its origin in the primitive flight part of our fight or flight instinct. The avoidance mental action pathway is so powerful because it has been hardwired into our biology throughout our history. This primitive, automatic, innate flight pathway is our emergency action to run or hide from life-threatening danger. In animals, it is a favored means of survival. For example, it has been shown that some species instinctively distinguish the distant shape of a predator bird from that of a safe silhouette, automatically releasing red alert chemicals that signal the need to run. In our relatively civilized society, physically running away is seldom effective. First, modern technology makes it easy to find people. Second, physical life-threatening stress is uncommon. Most people constantly face symbolic danger and pink alert chronic psychological stress. Thus, we learn to substitute mental means of avoidance for physical ways to run away. Running away to escape a mugger is actually a problem-solving response rather than avoidance. Our intelligent mind creates ingenious alternative ways to avoid discomfort. Most preserve short-term pleasure at the cost of a longer-term harmful outcome. Present feelings are often innately more powerful than objective reason. Reason lacks the force of emotion unless we teach ourselves the endorsement skills that link emotion to the intelligent action choice. The avoidance mental response pattern is discouraged because the longer-term and sometimes the shorter-term outcome no longer works and often is dangerous. Here are some readily observed avoidance patterns our mind substitutes for physically running. Procrastination, finding another activity to escape an unpleasant task. Socially running, changing jobs, spouses, friends, residences, and so on. Substance abuse, inappropriate use of alcohol, drugs, and food. Telling lies. It was my brother who did it. Withdrawal, isolating oneself physically and or emotionally. Self-deception. The mind is so effective, deception is accepted as truth. For example, denial. I can stop drinking whenever I choose. Rationalization. Excuses believed by the individual but no one else. The traffic makes me late. It's because my biorhythms are off. Paranoia. Projecting our uncomfortable ideas, feelings on another. They don't like me because I have pimples. Substitution displacement. Angry with his boss, he kicks his dog. Regression. We revert to an inappropriate pattern that previously worked. A 4-year-old wets himself when a new sibling gets more attention. Physical and/or psychological illness. Feigned or exaggerated physical and/or mental illness may excuse one from facing a stressful reality. Becoming Napoleon or some other powerful person is more satisfying than being a nobody. Most common expressions of the avoidance response, such as substance abuse and procrastination, are easily spotted. Patterns involving mental self-deception are among the most difficult to manage because individuals believe their distorted thinking. I would like to consider in greater detail the various means of self-deception our mind uses to replace the hardwired instinct to physically run or hide. However, my priority is to first provide you with the most crucial, a new way of thinking wisdoms that popularize mental wealth and establish a substantial grassroots movement of peace leaders. I hope to revisit the more difficult to recognize self-deception means of avoidance at some point, but in the meantime, there are many books available that address these mechanisms our mind creates to avoid discomfort. Negative action patterns are our major source of unhappiness and danger. The most effective ways to control avoidance behavior and the other 5 negative patterns is to learn and practice the common sense, newer way of thinking. Focusing on the 2 universal positive mental responses, problem solving and self-endorsement, often brings about the desired change without even having to directly challenge the avoidance mental response pattern. The negative responses tend to atrophy or melt away as the problem-solving and self-endorsement action pathways are more regularly practiced. In addition, developing the positive responses often motivate the individual to directly attack their negative patterns. Many additional methods such as love, education, counseling, religious healing, relaxation training, yoga, meditation, medications, and a supportive environment are effective. Individuals who rely on the mental self-deception avoidance behaviors often lack motivation and resist giving up their defense against discomfort. They are more difficult to persuade to engage in the self-education that inspires better alternatives. In addition to the various interventions here indicated, social pressure and strict limit setting may be required to control antisocial and harmful behavior. I have learned not to give up on resistive individuals because of my prior work with lifestyle drug addicts and antisocial individuals. There are many ways to encourage, sometimes bribe, even the most resistive individuals to come around. Please don't miss the next trend, the universally powerful common sense problem-solving mental action pathway. Here's wishing you tons of mental wealth.
Okay, so if you recognize these so-called negative patterns, this is what Sigmund Freud spent a lot of his life in writing and talking about, that subconsciously or even unconsciously, we engage in these patterns, that they're very common, and most of them are fairly easy to recognize, but some of them, like denial, when people really believe their self-deception, are more difficult to deal with. So things like paranoia, projection, and denial are all patterns of avoidance. And so there are many, and the question is, can we recognize them in ourselves? So that's the general idea of the avoidance response. So I'm going to pass the talking stick around and see if you can share any of these ideas in your own life experience. This is the way you'll learn more rapidly to avoid these negative responses. These may be the most difficult to identify in ourselves.
No, I can identify it in you much easier.
Yeah, that gets back to the blaming response.
Well, there are two things that came to mind. I don't, you mentioned in the talk that these things are easy to see, but not by the person who's engaging in it. And I think that that's a truth. That's a reality. I don't think that's blaming. I think the nature of these problems, some of the self-deception, comes because it is when you learn to recognize it, it's easier to see it in someone else, but it doesn't make it any easier, or it doesn't make it a lot easier to identify in yourself, because I think these are still very hard things to address. Even when you're aware of some of these, still hard to see it in ourselves. The second thing that came to mind is one of the things, and you alluded to it in the talk, was it's getting a little confusing for me. We have, 7 plus, we have 7, then 7 plus 2, and then we're on the third of 8, 8 men, I can't even remember what the name are.
Control panel.
Of this mental, control response thing. And it seemed to me I'm getting a little lost in the numbers of things that we're addressing. But what started to make sense to me is, for this issue of avoidance, it really relates back to a lot of the 7 plus 2 things that we talked about. And I wonder if there's a way to simplify the model, or even to just make some connections, like, in school when you have, 2 columns of things and you have to draw a line from something in column A to match column B. It seemed to me like, this avoidance response, this number 3 of 8 is in one column. And it seems to me to relate to a couple of the 7 plus 2, the idea of, turn on our energy factory. If it turns on our energy factory, but that's directed in the wrong place, then that's one way of understanding these other notions of mental response control that you're talking of. And I think you mentioned 2 of them, and I forget which 2 in the screen, but it would help reinforce the 7 plus 2 notions if each of these mental response things we talk about take us back to the original tool set that you were trying to teach people to use. And it just seems like it would help me if they were related, and I could, as opposed to, now here's another 8 things I have to remember on top of the 7 plus 2 that I'm already working on.
PC doesn't like homework.
Yeah, actually, I will comment on that now. Actually, we've used, well, I don't know if we've introduced the word strengths, but a strength is one of the principles that strengthens our mind, our ability to deal with our life experience. And there are literally hundreds of strengths. So it would be nice if we could really simplify them. And maybe there's a way to do that. I would certainly welcome that. But these are really snapshots. We'll see that the 7 word switches elevate our thinking, and the 8 mental freedom control panel, maybe the better way of saying that is just, these are 8 choices that we have available to us. In any situation, once we can label them, the idea is, in order to resolve a problem, the first step is to label it, to give it a name, because once we give it a name, then we can use our imagination to deal with it. So we need to identify, there are many more patterns actually to learn other than the ones that we've mentioned. But what we'll find out is, as we get to use them, that they do fit together, that one leads to another, that once we get it, that blaming out often leads to blaming in, and so on, and avoidance, that these are really not snapshots. After we begin to use them, they begin more like motion pictures. We see where one leads to the other, and we begin to see a pattern evolving. And some people eventually will see that we have certain patterns where we use these responses in different orders. It's not just one kind of thing. But sure, if there's a way we can simplify it, That's something we can work on. But my own, just to respond to your comment, there are lots of strands or ideas or concepts that we need to learn. And even the 7+2 and these 8 are just a beginning, the most fundamental, and sort of like the alphabet of the language that we make. When we have the alphabet, then we make all kinds of other possibilities that begin to make sense in communicating.
In this model, and maybe this is just wishful thinking, but is this avoidance response, is that one of a variety of ways, or can the avoidance response be, I'm thinking of sentence diagramming in school, where you take a sentence and you'd pull out the verb and the noun and the adjective. Is the avoidance response kind of dissectable into 2 or 3 of the word switches gone wrong, where we, you know what I'm saying? You know, is it a problem of the control factory and the you know, the notion of urgency and emergency? You know, if you take the 7+2 and those are, you know, we're doing the non-functional side, does that result in avoidance? I'm just wondering, you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I do. I think the point is that yes, they are. They're overlapping and they're related. But see, when we talk about avoidance, we've already got maybe 8 or 10 already different varieties of avoidance that we've talked about. That's procrastination, lying, and paranoia, and so on. These are all more subheadings of avoidance. And as a matter of fact, the most powerful of the positive responses is self-endorsement. That's what we'll be discussing at the next mental freedom control panel item. But it's the very same item that's on the 7 word switches. So they're overlapping, and they serve in many ways similar purposes. But after you learn the basic vocabulary and the alphabet, then it becomes a matter of putting these together in a way that I think makes a difference.
Isn't this avoidance, and if you think of it in a more positive way, I mean, if you've got a lot of things on your plate and you choose to focus on the more positive things that are happening rather than the negative things that are happening, that's a kind of avoidance, if only you get a good check for that. And denial in the same way, if there are a lot of, you know, if there are a lot of unpleasant things in your life and a lot of pleasant things in your life, and you say, well, I'm not going to worry about the unpleasant ones. I can't do anything about it, so I'll focus on the good stuff. That's really avoidance and denial in a way. So isn't there a sort of a continuum where rather than being destructive, it's constructive?
What I'm going to do is first thing is, when we are done with this meeting, I'm going to share this video, Brad's recording, with a friend of mine. I was telling you, Marilyn, about briefly about before the meeting started. This happened earlier this week, and you know, now it makes so much sense. One of my friends, Basu knows him very well. He left India to work in Malaysia, and the first day of his job, he met his boss, and they were talking to each other. And because something happened in the conversation, and his boss used a very abusive language with him on day 1, like they have just met. And you know, he just immediately he came back home and he texted me and he said, Sharat, I want to leave this country. Just one word his boss used, and he says, you know, immediate flight. So of course I had a 1-hour conversation. Of course I had a lot of fun at his expense, but once we got down to the serious business of tackling this scenario, you know, I gave him a lot of suggestions which he is working on. Of course I don't know how much he will be able to do, but one of the questions which I asked him is, what did you do when you are completely, you know, when you are shocked that somebody used an abusive language in a corporate setup which is not allowed at all? And he said, I didn't do anything. He just used that language with me and I just kept quiet. And then I decided I will not do it. So you see how there are so many things. First of all, he did not confront. He avoided a confrontation, and then he's avoiding a complete, a complete opportunity to work in a very good company, in a very big, in a very good area, and trying to just run away back to India, saying where he was not happy and he wanted to go outside and work in a different organization. So this makes so much sense to me. Uh, just one thing to add is what Pacey you were saying reminded me of the Karate Kid. You know, in Karate Kid, when have you seen the movie Karate Kid? Yeah. So in that movie, what happens is the teacher, he tells the student, "You wipe my house, you wipe my car every day," and he's doing all these things, and it doesn't make sense to him at all. And he confronts his teacher, and he says, "What the hell are you doing? You are making me clean your entire house." He says, "No, no, no. This will all make sense to you." And he hits him, and suddenly he does that. So I think all of us uh, are going through that phase here, where some of the things that Don doesn't or Don is putting so many things in front of us, it might not make sense. At least for me, I want to hold on and have a little more faith and see how where this goes.
I wanted to comment on this, on your Marilyn, your comment. But see, if people, people, for example, I've interviewed over 200 people on about world peace, and virtually all of them say they avoid thinking about it because they think there's nothing they can do about it, or it's uncomfortable to think about. And yet it might be something important to do. So they have short-term gain. They avoid the anxiety of thinking of a negative aspect, but then they don't do anything to deal with the issue. So one of the common things we have is a placebo effect. We often tell ourselves lies and so on, and they lead us to be comfortable for the short time, but it doesn't resolve the problem. Anxiety and pain sometimes are messages that are helpful and normal because they tell us there's a problem to be solved. But if we do something to avoid facing that, we just shut down the pain, and then we never deal with the issue that really needs to be dealt with. So it's short-term gain. It does feel better, as you point out, but in the long run, it may not solve the problem. It just goes on, and often the problem doesn't need to be solved. So that's why placebos can be so effective. But many times when we use this mechanism of avoiding dealing with a difficult issue, it just keeps going on and it festers until it can then erupt and become life-threatening or else very dangerous.
So, Mr. Miyagi, are you saying that we need to embrace the challenges that we're facing with impending world destruction and do something about it and stop avoiding it?
I think the idea is that so many people don't want to think about it because they think it's uncomfortable. So our tendency is to operate from our animal brain, which is based on pleasure and pain. And of course, pleasure leads to certain activities, but pain is often a signal for us to take action, to do something to avoid a difficult problem. So pain is sometimes, as we said in Brad's recording, it's appropriate when you have a mugger after you. It's good to run, physically run away. So these responses at times can be basic and very helpful, but if we get rid of the discomfort that is a warning to us, we're not doing ourselves a long-term service. We're doing yourself a short-term avoidance of just trying to be comfortable for the present moment. Remember one of the memes we said that's our present meme is what's good for me and my family for here and now. we're just dealing with the present. The idea is we need to think not just of the present, but of tomorrow as well. And that's something that comes from our ability to use imagination and our higher brain. I don't know if that explains.
Isn't that about what the Alcoholics Anonymous creed is all about? About ability to change, identify the things that you can change, and understand the things you can't change, and know the difference.
That's exactly, that's why it's one of the most powerful statements. That you'll call it a prayer, but it really, it is essentially, it says, it's by labeling, it's by giving it a name. Once we name it, we have the ability to deal with it in our mind.
It sounds to me like what we're talking about here is the age-old difference between treating the symptom and dealing with the cause of a problem or an issue. Dealing with the symptom is turning away and finding some refuge in your mind from something that's discomforting. But the problem under the underlying cause will no doubt continue if you don't face it. I mean, with regard to Shavat's friend who he mentions, I mean, every time I had an abusive remark from an employer, if I were to leave the country, I would have run out of countries by now. I've also found that in a situation like that, reverting to a childhood technique of wetting myself keeps people away from me. And that works too.
So that is precisely what I told him. I said, can you guarantee that when you go back to India and work, will you get a boss who will not, he may not abuse you, but he may make your life hell if he wants to or she wants to, So that is not the way to handle it. I give him a lot of suggestions. I don't know how much he will do. But then the bigger point which I was bringing is something which made him feel so bad that he wants to leave a country, that he left everything in India and went to that. He did not even protest. He just procrastinated that entire protest. He didn't say a word. And he just was, I don't know how that happened, but really alarming, how things changed for him. His dreams got shattered in a day.
But what is his cultural orientation in India? Is it a totally different culture in a business capacity where you're treated with extraordinary respect even from your employer when you are called on the carpet? Does he not have the experience of being spoken sharply to by an employer?
No, he's my friend, so he has been treated very badly throughout our friendship. That is what was more shocking to me. Like Basu and I, we are friends. We treat each other like shit anyway. So he should have been used to it by now. So, but then I think no, it's not that. It's just what that is what this avoidance. We know this guy to he has avoided a lot of things in his life, and all of us do that. It's not just him. It's just that he has done more than others, and he has been avoiding a lot of decisions in his life and a lot of uncomfortable scenarios in his life. So now it has come back, and it is stinging him very hard because he left everything back. He left a good job, he left a good career, and he moved to a different country assuming he will get better things there, but he ended up being with the same people and the same kind of scenario. So in my view, nothing has happened. It's just one word from a guy. He could have done several things there, but that shows, how even mature people, not only children, like some of the examples given by Don in that, or you were for children, but even mature people, they avoid so many things. I have met so many guys who give me hundreds of, reasons of why they drink, alcohol, why they do this, and how they can leave everything and go. A lot of things. I myself have been doing a lot of in the past 2 weeks in my job, but it's when as Pacey you were saying earlier, when somebody else does it or when you listen to it later on, it all makes sense, but then you forget it.
All right, here's what I'm thinking. Avoidance is when you take one action, like you don't like confront or whatever, or you don't address it, and you replace that with some negative behavior, be it drinking or, beating up on yourself or whatever. Because in that situation, I think if my boss had said something negative on the first day, I might have walked away as well. But to me, it's not avoidance in that case, because I'm going to wait and see if it happens again. I'm going to wait to see if the person apologizes. Now, if I wait and he doesn't or she doesn't, then maybe I'll address it. However, if I go home or I leave my job, or I leave the country, or I beat up on my wife or husband, or if I, take drugs or whatever, then that's avoidance behavior. So I don't think walking away at some point is a bad thing. If you need to reassess the situation, it's actually a good thing. It's just don't replace it with, negative behavior. Then it becomes avoidance.
Yes.
You see, a lot of this, you have to go back to common sense. So, for example, if you're in a marriage, let's say, where your husband is abusive, it may be appropriate, to leave the marriage, and that's a healthy behavior, if indeed that were to happen. If Sherrod's friend were in a job where, in fact, his boss were continually abusive,
Yes.
it might be appropriate for him not necessarily to go back to India, but maybe to find another job, and it might even be more appropriate to go back to India. But see, if you use common sense, there are times when running away, as the example I gave, if there's a mugger that's after you, it's appropriate to start running. If somebody's trying to hurt you or whatever, and if somebody's cursing you out and you don't think it's appropriate, it might be appropriate to step out of the room, or just say, well, we have to call a timeout here, and we'll come back and talk about this later, because it might be your own emotions are so high that you would be explosive in a way that would be detrimental. But part of it gets back to common sense, avoidance, in the sense that we're using it, is when we're using short-term gain for long-term pain. We're getting rid of the discomfort, but we're really letting something fester and continue. That is a negative situation, when we should be, or better be wiser. It would be wiser if we were to say, can we go back to the productive one, which is, what can I do to help solve this problem? Is there any action that I can take that would make this better? And there are many actions that Sherrod's friend could have taken. One would be to step out, another would be to try to have a discussion with him, maybe to see if other people are having similar situations, and maybe if everybody else is feeling beaten down, it's time to call that boss the supervisor, and see if maybe that supervisor ought to be called under the carpet, and maybe he ought to lose his job if he's abusing people around the office. So common sense, of course, when you're using common sense now, that's a puzzle solving or problem solving. But in the sense that we're talking about here, of avoiding a real danger at the price of short-term comfort, that's one of the negative responses.
Don, let me ask you, under your heading of taking action, quote unquote, where into this the situation would matching that level of ill treatment to teach someone a lesson come in the sense, I'm not looking to escalate, I'm not looking to suggest anything incendiary. I'm saying perhaps you have a boss or an employer or someone that you're subordinate to who is doing this to you simply because they can, and they understand or perceive that your reaction will be passive. If your reaction is less passive than they expect, will that curb that behavior?
Well, you don't know what the outcome will be because we're so variable, but the issue, as I see it, if we learn to love ourselves unconditionally, then we've asked ourselves the question, is there any way I can be helpful to this person? Then we put ourselves instead of feeling the pain and so on, we realize this person could use some help. And if the usual pattern would be to want to get even and escalate them, escalate the situation, but that's what leads to war. But the issue is, it gets back to that again, the basic meme. What can I do with this other person that may lead to something positive? And when you love yourself enough, you're no longer so, when you feel good enough about yourself because somebody says a negative word or they put you down, you don't feel like you have to run anymore, because you know in your own mind that I'm okay with me, and this person really has some kind of a problem. And we all have these problems. It's not just, we all do the same thing. We've all had situations where we've let loose on somebody or done something and later regretted it. And often sometimes immediately regret it. And hopefully the other person will be loving enough that instead of wanting to fight us or strike back or whatever, or get even, they might ask the question, I wonder if there's some way I can try to help this person. So we're really talking about education. And instead of trying to re-educate ourselves and other people, we often have this automatic, I call it an addiction to negative thinking, and we don't realize it. That's the key issue. We don't realize these issues, but when we can label them, if you can label these 8 responses, you're in a much better position to know how and when to use them and when to avoid using them.
Aren't we still talking about knowing the difference and how, if you're by yourself, I mean, you can learn the things that we've been talking about, but how do you identify, do you really need other people to point out to you some of your avoidances? I think we all agree it's easy to identify these avoidance techniques or denial in other people, but not so easy in ourselves. Is it a group like this? Although we tend not to point our fingers at other people and saying, well, you're denying this. But how does somebody do it unless they're in intensive one-to-one therapy or something like that?
I think this is the answer is GD seminar, in a sense, where we get together. I have learned a lot in the past 2 years from these GD seminars. This is like my weekly introspection, 1 hour of introspection. I say, oh yucks, I did this wrong. Now I know. Not that I learned. As Don keeps telling me and everyone, is that we have grown up, through evolution or through the way we were raised in a certain manner for several years. And we have all that, clogged up here. And it is very difficult to have that 1 hour and change things. But I look at it slightly in a different way. Either I can think about this in this 1 hour, or I don't think at all. So this 1 hour is much better than not thinking about it at all in a week. So GD seminar is, of course, one way. We are not living in we try to avoid either or. So I'm sure there are other ways where we have, like my friend reached out to me, and as I said, I had some fun at his expense, but we did do a lot of serious discussions. I gave him a lot of suggestions, some of them similar to what you gave, Don. I don't know, as I said, I don't know what he did. One last thing is, Brad, what you said is a very dangerous proposition about reacting.
I'm a dangerous guy.
Yeah, while I would not try it, but I would love to see someone trying it. Just for the fun of it, to see what happens.
Well, bullying takes all sorts of forms. I mean, obviously, it's mostly a juvenile situation, but it can take place in the workplace too.
Yes.
And the question is, when you don't respond, when you walk away from bullying, do you perpetuate the bullying? Or do you stand up and strike a blow, an effective and reasonable one for your own self-esteem?
Yes. But then it bites sometimes. I did that in 2016, and it bites very hard when, people in power, and we now see with this Me Too movement and all those things, people in power, they use their power and abuse their power in the worst forms of way. And while avoidance may not be the right, if we can handle it with a more common sense approach rather than just reacting to it, we might be in a much better. Because one thing I just remembered, I saw this video where this elderly couple, they came out of the bank with a bag full of money, and there was this suddenly a car stopped by, these burglars were there, and they tried to take the bag away from there. It was full of cash, and the couple, they tried their level best to hold on to the bag, and his wife was not leaving the bag in any way. And what the burglar did is he just reversed his car, and the car went over the wife, and they took the bag anyway. So I'm sure it was a lot of money. It was their lifelong savings. I don't know, but of course that was not more than the value of her life. So again, it is very easy for me to sit here and then share this. I don't know what I would do even if somebody takes $1 from me. But it's just, we have to somehow get that common sense approach at the right time, especially in tough scenarios.
So Brad, I was shaking my head because for several reasons. One, as a people manager, you do have a lot of power. Especially as this new person was coming in, I thought whatever that situation was that that you described, Sharat, and this guy did that to your friend, that was egregious, right? And there are mechanisms at work, there are programs at work to allow it to be addressed. So if your friend he doesn't know if suppose that, like I said, walk away the first time, maybe the manager would have apologized, maybe he was having a bad day, I don't know. I don't think it's always necessary to address something, especially with the same force that's being directed toward you in that moment, right? Sometimes you wait and see. But I don't think too that his friend should be allowed to be bullied. If this is a bullying situation, again, address it the proper way. Having the friend, stand up to him in some violent or equally aggressive way is never matching. Violence begets violence, right? It never is the best way to approach the situation, especially in a professional work environment.
Well, I was never suggesting violence.
Okay.
Never at any time.
Okay.
Really, these altercations that I'm thinking in terms of are primarily verbal.
Remember, violence was a healthy and adaptable approach for our ancestors who didn't have any better way to resolve problems. If you're competing for limited food resources and there's no other way, we don't have very good language or communication, then it's survival of the fittest. And in that situation, for 3.5 billion years, that behavior was a healthy adaptive behavior. It's just that now that we're trying to create a higher level of living, so civilized living, of reciprocity, where we enjoy one another and help one another instead of competing for limited resources. We live in a world now where we can make enough food, we can make enough water and so on. We don't have to fight for limited resources. And we have ways now of using imagination and language that we can negotiate our differences and compromise that our ancestors didn't have. But for 3.5 billion years, our genes have been passing on a behavior pattern that leads us to react and be ready to either fight or run. But this is an automatic habitual response that we're just becoming aware that violence is no longer very productive. And especially what Einstein is telling us, when you have weapons now, when you're not fighting with teeth and sticks and stones anymore, you eat with everybody. If every child, every person, every animal had a weapon that could destroy everything or everything in the area in 2 minutes or instantly, then you can see how ridiculous the idea of fighting is in a modern world. That's what Einstein was telling us. We have this addiction, the way that we automatically respond, but we're not aware of it. Until we become aware of it, we're not able to change it.
And violence doesn't necessarily mean the physical act of violence. Sometimes it is, uh, it is the verbal act, or uh, the why I agree with you, Josephine, is because you never know. Once you escalate it, you never know how it will stop or where it will stop. It reminds me of those what is that movie 13 Days, where uh, in 1960s, where Cuba had the nuclear weapon, right, from Russia, and Kennedy was mulling over what to do. And I don't know how true this is, but one of the generals told him that let us go for full attack, let us not wait. And because there are but Kennedy resisted it uh, to the tooth, but he said no, there is no way. The reasoning that the general gave is, when you do a full attack, they will just accept defeat, because they don't know, they would never anticipate it. Uh, but Kennedy said, you don't know it, you're just assuming it. And we know from the experience of Vietnam what happened there later on, where initial days it was said within 6 months we will defeat them, and then within 2 years we'll defeat them, and within 5 years, and then uh, it escalated and escalated and escalated, and so many people died because of that uh, thinking that, I know what will happen when I escalate something. So we never know.
And I don't know either, if it was cultural. I always give the person the benefit of the doubt, at least the first time.
Yes.
So Brad, I do agree that no one should be bullied, right? And that you need to figure out how to stand up for yourself if you feel you're being bullied. I do agree that if you're feeling you're bullied, you need to figure out what's the best way to stop that. So I tell my team, I go, you guys, in our roles, you don't have the permission. You don't have my permission to get nasty with anyone. If anyone you feel threatened, you feel bullied, you feel like they were unnecessarily rude to you, you come to me and I will handle it. I am the nicest person, but no one will say I'm sweet. No one is going to, challenge. I don't worry about being challenged, but I don't give them that authority, because the people who are coming to them and addressing them, mostly it's just having a bad day or they need help, and it's their an impossible way that they're using to ask for help. It's a ridiculous way that they're asking for help. And then my staff might feel a little offended. So they don't have that permission. They're always the ones that respond. I'll respond with grace and very nicely. But let me tell you something, no one's going to mess with my team. And they know that, right? So I think in the issue of the first day at work, the friend was coming into a situation they had no idea who was going to be their champion to defend them. But most companies, at least in this day and age, have a way, to resolve that in the correct manner and to remove that kind of negativity.
Well, your team is very fortunate. I mean that, really, because I must tell you how many times, and these haven't necessarily involved me, but I have witnessed the most toothless responses to these sorts of problems at the lower level of employees on the part of managers, middle managers, human resources departments who just look the other way, don't want to get involved, and they don't do their job. They're very derelict. And there are a lot of companies where the recourse to the individual is simply to separate from the company, file a labor action, get a lawyer, all those kinds of things. If you're in a situation where you really have the back of your team, they are very fortunate. But I will tell you, from my own personal experience, it isn't always the norm.
This reminds me, what you said, Brad, it reminds me of a very unpleasant thing that happened in my father's life. When he was working, my father is 5 foot high. He's very short guy. He never beat us. He never beat us throughout entire life. Like, my mom used to give a good beating to us once in a while, but my father, his words were enough. He was very, of course, non-violent, very educated, very intelligent, and his boss, used to work in a car factory, and his boss was very abusive. They had this culture, and probably they still have the culture where you can use abuses. It's a shop floor or a factory floor, so everybody is under high pressure to move things out. And he was abusing it. One day, just it ticked my father. My father, who had never said a bad word to anyone, he never uses abuses. He just lifted a big iron rod and he went and started, like he was about to hit, and he tore that boss's clothes. And everybody was shocked. Like, what happened? Why is Ramdas doing this? And when he came home, we were watching a movie at night, and he was so angry. He said, just shut the TV. And then everybody, later on, we came to know what happened with him and how. Now, thankfully, good sense prevailed on both sides. People came to their rescue, and the boss who tore my father's shirt and my father who tore the boss's shirt, they both were saved. But when you go overboard, in trying to ruin somebody's entire mental capacity to think straight, you abuse them and you heckle them every day. At some point of time, people will just and in those days, not everybody had choices like today, Don, where they could simply change their job, especially when you have been with a company in a location for 20 years. So things go bad, very, very bad sometimes.
Well, they can.
You are on mute, Pacey. Oh, sorry. Okay.
One thing that comes up as a recurring theme, I think, is the notion of learned helplessness. Is that one of the barriers to people recognizing that they can do something is that they've learned that they're helpless in that situation. And to me, it kind of gets back to how does this relate to the other word switches? And one of the, because for me, a lot of the challenge of the whole program is how do I recognize things in my life as day by day events go on? And to me, if I'm challenged by something or confronted by something, and I can see myself, walking away, or what may look to someone else like avoiding a situation, sometimes it's not that at all. Sometimes, as Josephine says, you may decide that I am going to walk away because now's not the right time to address it. They may be having a bad day. I may choose to address it in another venue. So I think that there are times when what may look like an avoidance response isn't. It may be, in many situations, it's harder to walk away than to engage someone who's taunting you or someone who's crossed you. I don't think that, Dad, you mentioned, common sense, we have to subscribe to common sense. I don't think it's always that commonsensical. When you look at a situation from the outside, very hard to know what the best or the obvious solution is. Similarly, when we talked about when someone's about to mug you and, you decide to run away. Well, from the outside, that may look like avoidance, but that's also an appropriate considered decision. So if someone has looked at this situation and decided, I'm going to turn on my energy factory and I'm going to use it to run as fast as I can and avoid this, that can be a very good decision. Similarly, the fellow that you described, Sharat, who had this one, confrontation and decided to leave the country, that's a tremendous amount of energy. So I think, for me, I'm trying to think, well, what else goes into it? Because this person's energy factor was obviously motivated. They used it. But, we're standing on the outside saying, well, that's not an adaptive response. And I can think of a mindset that would make that very adaptive. I mean, I could think of, if I'm going to this new place, am I going to work for this person? Am I going to devote my life energy to a person who would do this, who would use that language with me? I might decide I don't want to make his universe or his company's universe a better place by bringing my skill and my devotion and my work to that. I would rather unravel my life. I'd rather move back to a different country and do this in a place where I think I'm contributing to a better world and not just here to make a buck. So I think these are very internal decisions, and it's hard to look from the outside and always pass judgment on what's an avoidance response versus a considered response. And I think that's one way in which, an example of which you can. It's hard to use common sense because no one has a common experience. Everyone has a very unique individual experience, and I think it's in some ways easier to paint a common sense solution onto something that has very specific parameters.
I agree.
I would like, if anyone else has any other ideas, because this, I do struggle to try to think how I can work this into my life. What are the other of the 7 words or the 7 thought patterns? What are the other things besides energy factory that play a role in avoidance? I think, if I'm trying to dissect this avoidance thing and say, well, one is an energy factory notion. Either you do or you don't turn on your energy factory. Another is self-endorsement is part of this avoidance thing. Is that if there's often kind of destructive behavior or destructive thinking that goes into avoidance. And so to me, avoidance has, an energy factory flavor, and it has a self-endorsement flavor. And I'm wondering, does anyone have any thoughts? Are there other pieces of the language that we're trying to use to try to dissect this avoidance response, which is varied?
Donnie, why don't you click off the 7 word switches, because I can't bring them all to mind immediately.
The 7 word switches. Okay, well, the 7 word switches are the first one. I think I can. Substitute thinking for thoughts. Thoughts are what our animal brain keeps pushing into our consciousness. But thinking is what we do something about it. And then I allow.
Well, before you go on to that, I think I can. Avoidance might be connected to I think I can't, so I'm not going to do it, or I'm not going to try. I think what Pacey's saying is let's connect these concepts together. And I think that rather than try to do everything at once, that might be one where avoidance is I think I can. And
yeah,
so
I think that's what I suggest. So the first one, this is the energy factory one. And I think the things that seem to make sense to me is that the avoidance has to do with the energy factory of the, I think I can being on or off, and the self-endorsement. But so the other ones, I agree with you. Maybe we could talk through the other ones and see, do they fit in some way?
So this, the second one, even the I allow, is perfect where, where what Josephine was saying, that she would, in such a situation, she would get away. So somebody like me would confront it, but somebody like Josephine or somebody else could say, I want to get out of it, but I allowed it. That is why I'm not sure how to put it in words properly, but that is, if I don't confront and I move away, I allowed it, and I'm happy with it. I'm okay with it, allowing it. That's fine. It's not him. I allowed it to happen, and that is why I am moving away.
Yeah.
We're getting near the end of our time, so please make your last comments.
maybe we could pick this up again next time in terms of coordinating them. I agree with Pacey that
yes,
there are a lot of little things hanging out there that could be tied up in a little neater package.
Yeah, I think no. This is a brilliant idea where the platform that Don has prepared. We are trying to make a new train over it, or have a new train run over it. This is a brilliant thought, Pacey. So maybe we can do this next time.
That's fine if that's what everybody would like to do. If no one objects, we'll continue this at the meeting rather than go the next one would be the problem-solving response, the most powerful response. So we can continue this next time. Any other final comments?
Well, I think that we ought to. I think that we ought to talk about I think I can't, because when we're growing up or raising children, you reach a large part of their lives before they feel the ability or have the energy to say, I think I can, or the knowledge. I think that's a very important step in how you deal with, I think I can't.
One of the responses that we'll be talking about is, in fact, is the helpless response, where we shut down our energy factory, and it's one of the most dangerous ones, because as soon as we turn off our energy factory, we really are in a helpless, hopeless kind of a position.
And yet, when we're raising children, the first thing we say to our children if they come into a confrontational situation at school is, walk away. I remember that when my kids were young, this one is harassing me or so forth. Don't start it, just walk away.
But
so,
see, walking away may be a problem-solving response. See, you can't give, remember, avoidance is when we do something that really is not helpful in a constructive way, just delays the problem. But what sometimes walking away it makes common sense when you're in a situation not to get into a fight or to walk away, and that's no longer avoidance. It's a puzzle-solving or problem-solving response. So,
I went to school in New York City, and whenever I would walk away, I would get hit in the back of the head. But that may be irrelevant.
Sometimes we're in a situation, as we've said, where there is no good choice. The best thing is to avoid being in that situation. But that's we have to discuss that another way. I just wanted, Basu, did you comment yet? Did you have anything further you'd like to say? Basu, are you still there?
I don't want to.
Okay, so maybe Basu has stepped out or whatever. But just think about this as my closing statement. Because we are so addicted to this blaming response and avoidance, look at our criminal justice system. For the most part, throughout history, when someone makes a mistake or does something we think is against society, our usual answer is punishment. So we think of jail as a form of punishment. But today we're beginning, as we become a little more enlightened, to think of it as a way of re-education. It's not just a matter of locking somebody up, but it's a matter, can we have rehabilitation, rehabiting somebody to a more appropriate way of dealing with things. So, now it's true that we can think of limit setting instead of punishment. Limit setting is when you restrict somebody's behavior so that they can no longer keep killing or hurting other people. So sometimes there are ways of doing that, but you can also think of limit as trying to re-educate the person, not just punishing. So our criminal justice system, I think, is beginning to change a little bit for the positive, but for a long time, we've always thought that when somebody does something wrong, they deserve punishment. They deserve that's the blaming out the response again. Basu, did you have any final comments? We see your face here.
Actually, the story which Sharath was saying about our friend was true, and he was also speaking to me. So I think I agree that a lot of people have not matured with their age. Like sometimes it's not proportional to the age. It doesn't matter. Like, it's 40 is not necessarily 2 times more mature than 20.
Basu, this is being recorded.
But that doesn't apply to any of us on this program, on this conference, right? We've all matured for our age, and we've all got it together, so we don't do anything.
I don't know. I'm still pondering it at this point.
I'm going to put it on YouTube and share with him now.
I've just heard from my energy factory there's a union problem.
Okay, so
I don't think Kate has said anything.
no, I missed you, Kate. I'm sorry. Kate, what are your comments?
Well, you're also witty and fun. I just really enjoy listening to you, first of all. Thank you for sharing your sacred time and have so many good things to say. And I agree, Marilyn, we need to, this subject is just so, we need to delve deeper into it. It's kind of interesting, you know, I find myself in a place called Millersville, Maryland, just outside the DC. And I think it's this recognition of what Don was speaking towards, that as one person, we don't think we can do much about world peace. That has me on this journey thinking, because there's many peace initiatives. Yesterday I walked with the A21 people, and I met with the goddesses, and there's some freedom riders that are coming from the Lakota Nation. There just feels like there's a lot of peaceful things converging here, and in an effort to use my energy in such a way that we can do something about world peace. And so I'm hoping to, I had already asked Don's permission if I meet him with this David Williams, longtime peacemaker. I want him and Don to speak. And then on my journey out here, I'd like you all to just go to peacenow.org and check out this young man. He really seems to be doing a lot of wonderful things, Don. And so I hope those comments were heard in the way they were intended. And thank you for listening. And that's what I have to say at this moment.
Okay, you might just say the situation that came up with that it had to do with one of the Indian leaders was discriminated. You felt discriminated, put in jail for a long time. What was the situation?
Well, it's actually what is going on is these Lakota riders are on this Leonard Peltier freedom movement. If the Lakota, he just represents everything that is the atrocities that have come before them. He kind of nutshells that. And so they were, the Freedom Riders and this David Williams were kind of working together. And that's who I was hoping Don and David might get to meet. I'm sure they would inspire one another. And I'm just not sure where it all goes. You know, I kind of been out of touch while I've been on the road. I've just been on this personal journey and not sure how to answer you anymore, Dan.
But you're demonstrating activist action right now regarding some of the discrimination against Indian rights. Is that correct?
Oh, well, yeah, yes. I mean, I just, as this young man who I listened to, so I'm so impressed with that peacenow.org says, let's put the kind back in humankind.
Okay, so
justice for all people.
Okay. So the last point here that I will make is, it came up earlier that, as Sharad said, you know, for 1 hour a week, you know, he gets into a contemplative mode here in our meeting, and then it often drops. You know, the reality is, if indeed it's true that we are addicted to a certain way of thinking that's built into us over 3.5 billion years of training of our animal brain, and it takes, perhaps as Pearl brought out, it takes 18 or 20 years before our physical brain and physical self is fully developed, and then another 10 or 15 years before our emotional ability gets developed. So it suggests we really don't become mature adults until our late 20s or early 30s if we're doing well. We don't have much control over our early part of our life. But that's, I think, a very critical point that was brought up, that we begin to have the ability to take charge of our life for the most part when we're in our late 20s or early 30s, and most people never do that. They just go through life continuing the same way of thinking that we were inherited, our instinct and our traditions, and we never do much changing. The whole purpose, I think, of a genius seminar is to examine, to get a new language and change. The other point that I just thought I would make is that I think it's really great to begin to try to relate all these things together, but from my point of view, it might be a little premature, because until you develop the full alphabet, if you only have part of the alphabet, you don't have the basic letters, then you're somewhat limited. When you practice these basic word switches, I think you will find that automatically they will start becoming related to one another. You'll see they begin to fit together. All the puzzle pieces fit together. When you have only a few of the puzzle pieces, it's hard to put the full puzzle together. But when you have enough of the basic pieces of the puzzle, then you're able to do a much better job of seeing what the whole gestalt or the whole picture looks like. So thank you all, and we'll continue with our work group. I'm going to stop the recording now, and wish you all lots of love, and